Roll. Thank you for being here today. We are kind of a week ahead of our normal rotation, so thank you for being flexible with your schedule. We really wanted to allow everyone the opportunity to lend their voice and vote next week, so hopefully you will either have voted before next week rolls around or on election day. We are going to just quickly take a review of our agenda for today. Again, we'll just do these couple of routine announcements at the beginning, then we will dive right into trauma-informed interventions with our lovely guest expert, Miriam. And then Elizabeth McLaren has a case to share with us, and then we will have our discussions and our breakouts. If you do have kind of a new person from your group who has some good ideas in your breakouts, we would love to hear from some additional voices, additional faces when we come back together and report out. And so we will return at 3:12 to hear a recap of everyone's discussions, and then Miriam will close us out. And then, of course, we have Emily with kind of some of those final housekeeping details for us. So in moving ahead, here again are just some quick reminders. If you can go ahead and make sure that your name is displayed in the profile, that will help us to be able to take attendance. We are still looking for an interesting case on peer supports for not next week, for our final session, which is well into November. So we definitely have a little bit of time to pull together that case, but we would really, really like to hear from you. We have been busy posting more things in our in the Slack conversations, and then also on the resource page. So definitely utilize those resources. If you have any tech issues, Brandon is your guy. And if for any reason you do get bumped off, just feel free to rejoin us. Brenda, you have a question?
No, I was trying to sign in.
Oh, okay. All right. Well, we're happy you're here.
I'm sorry.
No worries. No worries. I think that's the first time someone raised a hand when I was speaking. I was like, ooh, I got to follow up here.
Oh, I'm so sorry.
No worries at all. Okay. All right. Well, since we don't have any questions, we'll just go ahead and move on to opening up and turning the reins over to Miriam. Miriam has worked in the field of trauma and resilience as a clinician, a researcher, a trainer, and a program developer for over 30 years. She's currently the Trauma-Informed Care Program Administrator at the Department of Behavioral Health, Developmental, and Intellectual Disabilities, and is the co-director of Kentucky's Project Aware with the Kentucky Department of Education. Previously, she has worked as Mountain Comprehensive Care Center at the UK Department of Psychiatry, UK's Center on Trauma and Children, and as an adjunct faculty at the UK College of Social Work. Miriam lives and works in Eastern Kentucky for almost 30 years, where she also worked to support community-based and nonprofit programs and activities in healthcare, behavioral health, social services, economic development, education, and the arts. In her spare time, she likes to read, hike, travel in non-pandemic times, and take in the arts. Well, I am delighted to have you and your expertise. Thank you for joining us. And you can take it away, Miriam.
Great. So Brandon, am I able to forward from here, or do I need to share my screen?
I need to stop sharing.
Yeah, Christine will stop sharing, and then you should be able to
share perfect.
And select your PowerPoint.
Perfect. Hi, everybody. It's nice to be at this point in your cycle, because you all know each other pretty well, and hopefully are feeling comfortable asking questions. So I would encourage you to put, oops, so this is great. Now we're at the very end. Hang on for one sec. For whatever reason, we ended up.
That was the beginning.
Oh, that was the beginning. Okay, yep. Sorry. Okay, there we go. So I would encourage you to put any questions into the chat, and I will ask Christine, if you see something that needs to be addressed, please interrupt. I come from a loud Northern family. You cannot offend me. Please go ahead and interrupt.
Okay.
And I am with that loud Northern family at the moment, and the MO is louder, faster, quicker, right? That's who gets heard. So at any rate, okay, so we're going to talk about trauma-informed interventions for families with young children, but what I really want us to think about today is to not only think about evidence-based interventions that are out there and that are packaged and manualized, because those are incredible, they're wonderful, it's important that you know about them, but what we also know is that everything that we do needs to be trauma-informed. And so we really want to think about what are the core elements and the core components of what anybody who interacts with these families does that are trauma-informed or should be trauma-informed. So to that end, I want to start by talking about the 6 basic principles of trauma-informed systems that are supported by SAMHSA based on some research. Then we'll talk about how those connect to the 3 core, there are many ways that you can frame child development principles, I know. I went with the 3 core principles of child development that are currently out through the Harvard Center for the Developing Child, so we'll just make that connection to see that. Then we'll look at what some of the assessment tools are that are out there for very young children, and then look at some of the evidence-based practices. So it's a lot to cover, and I say that but to say we are going to skim the surface, and we are not always going to be able to go deep in this 30 minutes that I have now, but hopefully some of it will happen in the case study that you do today, as well as other times. And I also know that people come with different levels of knowledge. So I always remind folks that, I learned years ago that in adult learning, for every hour that you sit in adult learning, you're supposed to get 1 good idea. So hopefully you'll still get 1 new idea, even if some of these things are not new concepts to you. I never talk about trauma without reminding us to be self-aware. And the reason that I think this is so important for those of you who train also is to remember that sometimes we can do the work and not feel particularly distressed by it because we have a role to play, we have a job to do. And we just keep going and putting 1 foot in front of the other, and we take care of what we need to take care of. But sometimes when we stop and we reflect and we think about things, some of what we see, hear, and work with washes over us in a different kind of way, and we feel it a little bit differently. So just to pay attention to your own needs. The one advantage of virtual webinaring is that we can turn off our cameras as we need to, take care of ourselves. But also when you're thinking about what you're going to do to manage whatever feelings you have, is to really think about those coping skills, not just in terms of quote unquote feeling good or being relaxing, but being coping strategies that actually help you metabolize what you're feeling, right? So that if you have strong emotions, how can you process those emotions? Maybe that's talking to somebody, a supervisor, a peer, somebody else in your professional world. Maybe it's talking to somebody personally. Maybe it is literally metabolizing the activated stress hormones by exercising or going for a walk or doing something like that. So the key is not to avoid the feeling or just pretend that they're not there, but to actually address them, process them. And this is, of course, indicative of what we should all be doing all the time. So just to think about applying that to our general practice. Hang on, the dog barged in. I just have to shut the door. Right, never fails when you're being recorded and on. Okay, flexibility is the name of the game. So I want to start with this nice quote from Barney Burstow. This is an old quote, but I think that it really is something that we should keep in mind when we're thinking about young families, because we're thinking about the children and their parents. We're thinking about this family that is somewhat a little bit of a nesting of different people, of kids and parents, and then extended family and community. But we're also thinking about each of those individuals and the layers that they have. And I particularly want you to be aware that when we talk about being trauma-informed with this particular target population of folks who we're serving, we're not only talking about the children, we're also talking about the adults. And those adults may have many, many layers of trauma that they are carrying around that we want to think about how we are addressing in this way. And I also want us to think about our goal, because I really, as I get older and hopefully a little bit wiser and learn more from other people, including the people who I've worked with for all these years. I think that we should never talk about trauma without also talking about resilience. The Secretary of the Cabinet for Health and Family Services, Eric Friedlander, really has made this a mantra of his. And he says, trauma and resilience are two sides of the same coin. And I think that we really need to be thinking about what's our goal. And our goal is to build resilient families, resilient individuals, resilient parents, resilient families, and then resilient communities. And in order to do that, I think that when we're talking about young families, we really want to hone in on two big areas that you guys have talked a lot about. I haven't been to every single one of the live scope sessions, but I have watched the ones that I've missed. And so I think this fits very nicely into everything that kind of a theme that's been going through. So one is relationships, and it goes without saying how important those are. And then the other is regulation and self-regulation. So we're really going to keep those at the forefront of what we're talking about today. All right, so these are the 6 principles of trauma-informed systems. So this comes from the work of Fallot and Harris, Roger Fallot and Maxine Harris, who in the early 2000s wrote a series of white papers, one in the early 2000s, I think 2001, and then they did a revision of it in 2009. And they outlined 6 principles. SAMHSA then took it and did a little bit of adjusting. And so SAMHSA has promoted this in their guidance for a trauma-informed approach. And the reason that I really like these 6 principles is because they are incredibly flexible. We can apply them to different kinds of work, different kinds of organizations, as well as different levels of work. So this can be applied to prevention, it can be applied to intervention, it can be applied to case management, to clinical services, to healthcare, to behavioral health, to occupational and other kinds of allied health fields, education, juvenile justice, etc. So just to bear in mind that these are big buckets, and there's a reason for that, but you can really run everything you do through this lens and get some really great guidance, because these are not foreign concepts, right? And so the trick is not to say, oh, this is something that's different about the way we're doing things, but to look at these 6 areas and to really pay attention to them and be very intentional about how we address them in everything we do. So when you look at these 6 buckets, these 6 areas, these 6 principles, what we want to think about is both content and process. So it's about what we are doing with the families and the people who we serve, as well as how we are doing it, right? So what we're helping them to do and how we are helping them to do it. And that dual process is really important, because as we all know, there is a very strong parallel process to all of this, right? So this is also true for how our organization should be run. A well-run organization should be trauma-informed and supportive to its staff, and these 6 principles could be a guide for that as well. So you can apply it in lots of ways. So let's dig in and think about the idea that, first of all, when we're going to use it. I would argue that every moment is a trauma-informed moment, right? When I was a therapist, people used to tease me that they were going to get a crown made for me that said that one of my favorite sayings, which was, every moment is a therapeutic moment. And as I've gotten older, I would now say every moment can be a trauma-informed moment. And being trauma-informed is like taking vitamins, right? There's no harm in it if it's not necessary in the moment, but you don't always know who really needs it and who doesn't, so why not be universal about your application? And that is really my approach, so that we can apply this universally at whatever point, and this is just one way of conceptualizing a vast array of services that you may be providing, but at any one of these points, you can and should be trauma-informed, as well as other ways that you do service delivery, whatever they may be. All right, so now let's dig in and think about these 6 principles. So the first one is safety. And I think you guys have talked about psychological safety, but we definitely want to pay attention to physical safety, especially when you're dealing with young children and young families. That's really important. We need to teach that. We need to reinforce it and support it. We're not only thinking about physical safety for the children, we're also thinking about physical safety for the adults. And we want to think about it in its broadest sense. So we also want to think about, what is it like if we ever get to be post-pandemic and people are coming to your clinics and your offices, what is it like to be there, right? Are the exits clear? Are the bathrooms clearly marked? Do people feel comfortable? And then that starts to get us thinking about this idea of psychological safety as well. So for me, psychological safety is really the crux of this. And out of the 6 elements, I don't think that you can have any of the other 5 unless you really have a good sense of safety and psychological safety in particular. So how do we achieve this psychological safety? Well, the biggest thing is consistency and predictability. So we want that for the kids. We want it for them within their family systems and any of the other activities that they do. We want that for them with us as providers, but we also want it for the parents, right? So that means that we want things like the same person showing up to deliver the service each time, that we do want to have as regular a schedule as possible. And we probably have to really work hard to create some of those things, because the lives of folks who we're working with very often are very demanding, very chaotic, not because that's what they're choosing, just because there are a lot of moving parts a lot of the time. And this is not something that we say, oh, we want them to achieve this, right? These are things that we create. We create this foundation in this way. So helping people get into a regular routine and us modeling that regular routine, creating that regular routine. We also know how important boundaries are for a sense of psychological safety. And again, we want to think about that in terms of us delivering the services. Are we very clear? And do we reaffirm what the boundaries of what we can do and our relationship with people is? That is reassuring. That's really important. And we don't want that to be a moving target. We want to be quite clear about that, not in a negative way or a, kind of an authoritative way, but just in a very clear, honest way. But that also models for young parents or new parents how important boundaries are for them to set with the other people in their lives, including their children, right? And we know how reassuring that is for kids. We want to be developing psychological safety for children by making sure that we are helping parents be highly responsive, attuned caregivers, right? So that they are reading the signals from their children, and there's this transactional dynamic that's happening that is creating a sense of attachment, that is creating this give and take, this serve and return that we know so well is so important. And as part of that, we want to make sure that parents understand that they have the power to help their children manage distress, right? This is the beginning of helping kids understand how to become regulated. So that seems really obvious to all of you who are in the early childhood world, and to some of the rest of us who may not be focused in that world but know about it. But I want you to stop and think for a minute about how complicated that really is with the folks who we're talking about, because we're talking about people who may never have had this themselves, so they didn't have any modeling for it, but they also then don't trust their own ability to soothe themselves. We know that there's been substance use issues, so we know that there have been external kinds of dependencies on how to feel soothed. And now people are trying to learn other ways of doing that, which can be very challenging. And now we're saying to them, oh, and by the way, you're the most important person in your child's life because you have the power to do this. And we see that as empowering, and that can feel incredibly overwhelming and frightening to somebody, right? So this is a very complicated task that we're asking people to do, and we're asking ourselves to support them in doing. And when you think about it in the context of psychological safety, the complexity of it becomes, to me, I think, quite apparent. So that's an example of why pausing and really thinking about running everything we do through this lens can be so helpful, because you start to see all of the nuances and all of the potential challenges in that way. Same thing with unconditional love and acceptance, right? We want to teach parents to give that to their children. We want to help them understand how important that is, why it makes such a difference. And yet that's a very, very difficult thing to quote unquote teach and model, especially for people who may have a lot of reasons why they're not going to trust that at first pass, or they don't trust themselves to be able to deliver that in some ways. clearly we want to stress, and to be trauma informed is we want to make a clear boundary around physical punishment, right? So I've spent a lot of years working with families, and families come with all kinds of cultural and familial standards, and that's fine that that's what they come with. But if we are going to be trauma informed, we have to be very clear that kids who have experienced trauma or are at risk for experiencing trauma should not have any physical punishment, right? We teach other ways to respond to kids. And so that we're never getting into this discussion about where is the line between it was punishment and consequence and it was abuse, right? Because we just say, sorry, no spanking, right? That is off the table in this way. And that may provoke some discussion among folks, and I'm willing to have that at some point, but I'm pretty clear about that. I've gotten a little bit probably more rigid about that as I've gotten older. And then of course we want to avoid re-traumatization. And again, to really think about what can be re-traumatizing. So starting with, what does it mean for somebody to have a professional in their life? That in and of itself may create some trauma reminders, right? Some triggers for somebody. So what are you up against? What do you have to pay attention to? What do you have to be aware of? And how can you acknowledge that this is difficult and that you recognize that and that you are aware of it and that you want somebody to let you know when they need a break, for example, or they need things to go a little bit more slowly, or they need you to do something a little bit more differently, right? So it's up to us to set that tone and that frame in that way. So I want you to think for a minute about what you already do in your practice or in your organization or agency that you think is promoting physical and particularly psychological safety for the clients who you work with. And then also, as an exercise, at some point, think about what you're doing to promote it for the staff as well. Christine, give me the high sign if we need to take any questions or somebody.
No questions so far. You're good.
Okay, good.
You're good.
Okay. So given that foundation, we'll, think about these other 5. So trustworthiness and transparency goes quite, hand in hand with psychological safety, as you can see. And this is something that we can actually, be very clear about what it is we do to promote this, right? So we want to model this and we want parents to model this. And this is, the basic kinds of things, but it's really hard sometimes. So we have to be really careful to do what we say and to say what we do, right? Don't make a promise that you can't keep. Don't even indicate you're going to deliver something. And if you do err, because we all do, and you say that you can do something and then you find out you can't, own it, apologize, take responsibility, model that. I am really sorry. I know I said that I could help you with this, but it turns out I can't. And here's why. This is what I can do to help you meet this need, right? That's what we want parents to be able to do for children. We have to be able to do it, right? We are not the be all and end all, and we shouldn't ever paint ourselves. And sometimes we do screw up. And boy, isn't that reassuring to other people when they see that we do too. The other thing about trustworthiness and transparency that can be really critical is to make sure that our informed consent is truly informed consent. So I spent a lot of time teaching ethics to social workers, and this is one of my big soapboxes, because informed consent is not signing a piece of paper. Informed consent is understanding and appreciating the risks and the benefits about what you're about to agree to. And appreciating it means understanding and being able to apply it to you, to say, this is what it will mean for me, right? Or for us to say, this is what it could mean for you. So this is a conversation. Sometimes it's the entire first session that it takes to get to this informed consent, but it's critical to make sure that we are truly being informed, helping people be informed. Same thing around releases of information. Doesn't usually take that long, but being really clear. This is the information that's going to be released. This is who's going to get it. This is how long they have access to it. It's going to be written. It's going to be verbal, etc. Be very clear. This is not just about signing pieces of papers. And in that way, to really think about what are the implications of whether somebody does or does not do things, right? There's always choices. We know that. But do people really know and understand? And are we being clear? And we don't always make up the rules, but we want to make sure that we understand them clearly and that we can help other folks understand them. Making sure that language and information is accessible both literally and figuratively, so that can people actually get to it? Can they understand it when they get to it, either because it's written at a level that they can understand and appreciate, or it's in a language that they can understand and appreciate, etc. Not depending on family members to be translators, those kinds of things. The other thing about trustworthiness and transparency is to have a roadmap, right? To let people know where they're going. Right? Because how do you feel when you go in for a service and somebody says, well, now we're going to do this and now we're going to do this, and you're not sure what the point is or where it ends or how long it's going to go on. So being very clear about those things. And if there are open-ended services, being very clear about that as well, so that there are no surprises in this way. So this idea of being transparent, letting people know what is going on, what the goals are, what the consequences are, what the good, what the bad could be, is really critical to building that trust. And that's going to enhance that sense of psychological safety, of course. Peer support is something that, is now kind of a given, but certainly was not always. And if you've been in the field as long as I have, you know that there was a time when peer support was the anomaly. It was not the norm. And how lucky we are now that it has become the norm, and that we, accept that we shouldn't do things to people. We do things with people, and we listen to what people need, and we make sure that we are hearing that and we are responding, and that we have people with lived experience who tell us this is what works and this is what doesn't work, because evidence comes in a lot of different forms, and we want to acknowledge a variety of sources, have multiple data points, right? I'm a mixed methods researcher, and this is mixed methods practice as well. Right, so we want to value that lived experience, and that models for people that all people are worthy. It also obviously helps with reducing stigma and avoiding the sense of perfectionism, so that people start to be able to understand that things wax and wane over the course of our life, over the course of our treatment and our interventions and our services, right? And sometimes things are going along swimmingly and we're making lots of progress, and other times we're plateauing, and sometimes we have setbacks, and that's all part of the package, and that's okay. Peer supporters can convey that with a lot more validity and legitimacy than a professional can in that way. So very important and helpful, and lots of opportunities for that with parents, I think. And I think how wonderful that is, because parenting young children is isolating even in non-pandemic times, right? So that peer support, we know how important that is, etc. This idea of collaboration and mutuality is very closely connected to that peer support. So this idea that we are doing things with the folks who we're working with, right? Who we are providing services for, right? That we are not doing things to them, or we're not doing things about them, that this is very much a collaborative and interactive and mutual relationship, that we are not lecturing, we're having discussions, that we are actively listening and hearing things. And by listening, we want to take the broadest sense of what active listening is. It's active observing, right? So we are seeing and noticing, we are hearing, we are using all of our senses to take in what somebody is communicating to us in lots of different ways. This is also about minimizing power differentials, right? A lot of times when we are working with folks who have been asked in a certain kind of way, because there could be serious consequences if they don't participate in services. So people are here maybe somewhat reluctantly. And so we want to be really clear about what it is, what is our role, what is our power, and what is their role, and what is their power in this situation, right? And how do we manage that, and how do we communicate and interact, and to recognize that they are the experts for themselves and their family and their needs, and we have other kinds of expertise to share and to see how they can fit together in that way, because this is really important for this sense of dignity. And again, to think about building resilience, right? How do all of these things build resilience through relationships and regulation? And this fits nicely into these ideas of empowerment, voice, and choice, right? So that we want to have authentic opportunities for empowerment, real opportunities for voice and choice at every possible turn. Small choices, big choices, they all matter. remember that one of the hallmarks of trauma is a profound sense of powerlessness. So having choices is super important. This is especially important for parents who, and especially new parents and young parents who often think that there is a right and a wrong way, right? And so we want to make sure that we are helping them see that some of this is choosing what the best fit for them, what feels best to them, and how they can do that, so that we can be strengths focused and resilience oriented. And we can promote a sense of advocacy and self-advocacy in that way, so that we are functioning as facilitators and guiders, and not directors or controllers in that kind of way. And finally, to really pay close attention to the impact of cultural, historic, and gender concerns. You know, we are all pretty clear that we need to approach anybody who we're working with a sense of cultural humility, whether that is about race, whether that is about ethnicity, whether that is about socioeconomic status or educational level, that we want to understand that where we come from is where we come from, and where they come from is what we're really paying attention to. We want to be able to recognize the impact of years and generations of trauma, oppression, being disenfranchised, and we want to find ways to promote equity in all of the ways that we are delivering services in our policies, our practices, and our programming, and to also recognize that the impact of intersectional identities, right? So that this can be really additive in a geometric way, not an additive way, but geometrically compounding in that way. And to that end, as much as possible, to find diversity in our staffing, and ways that we can actively counter disparities and micro and macro aggressions in that way. So this is obviously a whole other discussion, but really, really important to think about and remember, especially when you are working with a family who is different from you in one of these fundamental ways, and you're going to have to work harder to attend to these issues and be self-aware so that you can establish that sense of safety, and then the other 5 things. Okay, so those are those 6 components and how rich they are when you think about applying them to this. So I also want to think about the fact that, you know, they fit really nicely into this framework for child development, which is these 3 core components that come from this new science to policy and practice approach that the Center for the Developing Child is taking. So the 3 areas are these ideas of responsive relationships, core life skills, and reducing sources of stress. So when we think about being trauma informed in this idea of relationships, and we think about the idea of needing to promote those 6 elements, particularly safety, trust and transparency, collaboration and mutuality, and empowerment and choice, we think about this serve and return, as I said. So we think about the work of Bruce Perry, for example, who may have, many of you may know, who really talks about relationships as the change agent and the healer. But we also want to think about the relationships that we have with the adults in the room, with the adults in this service unit, right? So that, because we know that when adults are supported and when they can be the models, then we are building resilient children, resilient families, healthier communities. And if you want to look at some wonderful work on this, there are some beautiful, very short videos at the Center for the Developing Child that Jack Schoenfeld did. They're cartoon videos, and they're really lovely, and they're great to show to community groups that really, really stress this point. But we have to always remember, it's not only about what we're teaching the parents to do with their kids, it's also about how we are interacting with the parents, because we know that how we all respond to trauma is a physiological brain-body response that can make our frontal lobe go offline. And then you've lost a parent, right? If they are having a traumatic stress response to something that you've said or done, or to just being with you, then the teaching that we're doing, the modeling that we're doing, the support that we're offering is not going to be very useful, right? And they can't help their child learn to calm and regulate. We can't help them learn to calm and regulate. And we want to think about this idea that we know that there are these incredible overlaps between brain pathways, between substance use disorder and traumatic stress responses. They're not exactly the same, but they have some parallel factors to them, right? And so we know that they can reinforce one another in some very, very profound ways. And so we also run the risk that if we're re-traumatizing people, or if they are re-traumatized by their child and by the relationship there, that they may also be more at risk for using again. So there's all kinds of nuances and complexities to this that we really want to think about. That
Miriam,
second,
you're at like 5 minutes.
yep, perfect.
Okay.
The second one is this idea of core life skills. And so that speaks to the idea that we want to promote strong executive function in the youth as well as in the adults, right? So that they can manage, they can have this self-regulation to manage their thoughts, feelings, and behaviors, right? Because this is what's going to help them navigate the world in a healthy, constructive way. I want you to think about the fact that many of your parents didn't get this as children themselves. So you may, in effect, be reteaching, reparenting in a certain kind of way so that they are learning at the same time that you are helping them teach their children or create this environment for their children. And that becomes a very, very big job for us and for them, and one that requires a lot of patience and support, and to be very trauma-informed in our approach in that way. We know that teaching children to self-regulate requires co-regulation from the adults in their world, right? This interactive process between the caring adults and youth, so that kids can learn healthy ways to self-soothe, to manage those strong emotions, behaviors, and thoughts. We can't be good co-regulators unless we are able to self-regulate ourselves, right? So it is this cycle of needing co-regulation to learn to self-regulate as children, but if our adults didn't get that, then in a sense, they need some of that from us, and that's where the process piece of being trauma-informed with them is so critical. And will pay off in spades because they will be able to then do this with their children better. And then we also know that we're always looking to reduce or buffer sources of stress, right? So we understand what can turn tolerable stress from being tolerable because we have a supportive environment that helps somebody manage the stress into something that is toxic because they have to manage it completely on their own, particularly for children. And we know that constant stress is really detrimental, as you can see in this quote. So that given all of this, we do want to pay attention to what are we seeing in the kids. So the first thing I want to give you, and really this is just a list for you, these are the evidence-informed traumatic stress assessment tools for young children. Now remember, these are young children. Some of them go for kids who are a little, go up to kids who are like 10, 12, etc. But there are some that start it for kids who are 8 or so. But these are all appropriate, or there is a version of this for young children. So if you're not familiar with some of these, or you're not using one in your practice, I would urge you to consider whether that would be a useful part of an assessment, or at least somebody in the world of this family and child, and to make sure that your behavioral health folks are paying attention to what may be going on, right? Because we know that especially in young children, when there's a limited repertoire of how kids express themselves, traumatic stress can look like lots of other things. So what I want to end with is to give you some specific information about some of these evidence-based practices for families with young children. It doesn't make sense to go and describe them because you forget that as soon as you hear it. But what I want you to know is that almost all of these have elements of those 6 elements, or the 3 components of, and sometimes both, of child development, right? They are relationship-based. What I want you to think about is that when we are working with families of young children to be trauma-focused, we have to be working with the adults. There is almost never a time where to do a trauma-focused intervention, we are going to remove the child from the situation and just quote unquote deliver a service to a child, to a young child, because young children are dependent on their parents. So these are family-oriented and very often caregiver-oriented, right? So we see a lot of cognitive behavioral therapy, and we know from child development that kids' cognitions are different. They're just beginning to develop, especially for young children. So cognitive behavioral therapy is very much focused on the adults in the room, helping them to think about things differently. And you can see the number of sessions, and then you can see where I put in the notes who these are targeted for. That means what is the evidence around, right? So it doesn't mean that they aren't used sometimes for other groups of people, but this is where the evidence lies. And then if there's a modality that's not obvious from the title, what the modality is. So you see that, for example, attachment, self-regulation, and competence, ARC, can be done as an individual, a family, or a group intervention. It can be home-based as a preventive. Bounce Back and CBITS on the next page can be done as school-based interventions. So a good way to start to parse out. Not all of these are only used for trauma, but all of them would be considered trauma-focused in a certain kind of way. So for example, PCIT was developed as a behavioral intervention, but we know that it is very effective for kids with complex trauma who have had a lot of ongoing chronic approach. So I just want to have you look at this slide and see if there's anything that people haven't seen before. Somebody give me the high sign if anybody says anything.
You're good.
And this one, people may not know about PC Care as much. It may not be used as much, but it's out there. And then you see that some of these can go on for a very long time and are very, very intensive, like trust-based relational intervention, right? Which is this intensive home-based, right? As opposed to a visit, a once-a-week visit for other things.
So Ashley's saying that she's not familiar with Bounce Back.
Okay, Bounce Back is the early childhood. So for people who are early childhood people, and if you're working with childcare providers, Bounce Back is the early childhood version of CBITS. So it is about teaching kids self-regulation and coping strategies for when they feel dysregulated. Does not get into processing trauma in any way. It's very much about teaching those coping skills, what in TFCBT we would think about as being the PRAC skills, the beginning of that. So, what do you do when you have a big feeling? How do you calm yourself down? How do you, what do you do when you sense that you're feeling yucky in some way? But it's geared for preschool and young elementary school, or early, or I would say pre-K to like 4th grade is what it's for. Okay. We also have, I did want to make note of these for older kids, right? These are not for young children, but I noticed in the scope materials that they had included TFCBT. So we know that people say that you can use that with kids as young as 3. I think there are now some other kinds of trauma-focused interventions that may be more appropriate for very young kids. Depends on the child and the family in that way. Target is a relatively new intervention. It's excellent and it's very flexible in its use. So there are a lot of resources out there for you to understand that. What I want you to think about is that you really want to think about talking to your behavioral health providers about what they have in their toolbox. And the way to do that is to ask them some very, very pointed questions. Do they do a comprehensive trauma assessment that uses a trauma assessment tool? Get them to describe what they use and how they do it. They should be getting lots and lots of information from multiple sources. Ask them what interventions they're trained or certified to provide. Look at that list, go to the NCTSN, look at that list. See if you think from the description of it, does it fit this family, right? Because sometimes people say, well, but yes, we're trauma focused, but they only have one tool in the toolbox and maybe it's not the best tool for your particular family, right? So you have to do some of the work on this. Ask specifically, what's your philosophy in working with families who've experienced SUD or neonatal abstinence syndrome? You want to make sure that they understand that those are inherently, those families inherently need a trauma-informed, trauma-focused approach. Ask them what their expectations are. Do they seem like they are trauma-informed in the way that they deliver their services? Do they have any preconceived notions about caregivers who are using medication-assisted services for OUD, right? A lot of people still have very strong feelings about that one way or another. You want to know that before you send a family to them. And then find out, of course, how they will collaborate with you in that way. We did not get to some of the other things that I had as extras, but in the slides, I think, oh, here's the bottom line. You may see some things, but the bottom line is that all of our interactions have to be trauma informed. We have to pay attention to recognizing what people need more or less of, and to making sure that they're getting that. That interventions that are trauma focused should always be relational in that way. And that we should use an actual EBP if we see signs and symptoms of traumatic stress, if we see that the relational attachment is impeded, or if there's imminent risk of disruption or removal. But that at other times it may be that we are being trauma informed in the way that we are delivering everything else that is happening to this family, right? So every family that's been through trauma doesn't need one of those particular EBPs, but they do need a trauma informed approach in that way, because that will strengthen the adults in their family. Okay, sorry, I went over a little bit.
You are just fine.
I went over by 5 minutes, sorry.
No, it's totally okay.
All right. Lot to pack in. You know,
yes. Okay.
Nothing too long or too fast for me.
All right, wonderful. All right, thank you. And what we're going to do now just kind of is to move into our case presentation so we can apply some of these good nuggets of information that we just learned from Miriam. So let me go ahead and share my screen. Let's see, hold on one second.
Christine, do you want me to show it on my screen, or is Brandon?
Oh, if you have it, that's fine. That would be great.
Brandon, if you don't mind, why don't you pull it up if you have it already? If not, I can get it.
I do not have it open.
Okay.
Let me, I think I'll need to, I don't think you already are, to make you co-host.
Okay, so I do have it open if you need it, but if you've got it, that's easy too.
Christine, it's in your slides also, I think.
Yeah, I'm just pulling up the wrong.
Yeah, I can pull it up too.
So sorry.
While you're pulling it up,
I've got it right here if you want me to do it.
Thank you.
Yes, that's good.
I keep pulling up Miriam's.
Okay.
I really do have it on mine.
There you go. There you go. Just say slide, Elizabeth, when you want me to move.
Okay, good deal. Thanks. My name is Elizabeth McLaren, and I am the case that I'm going to share with you. I'm working with this family in the capacity of an early interventionist. And it was just wonderful listening to Miriam's presentation today, because I love that you said about working with all children and families through the trauma-informed lens, because you never know if you need it or not, kind of like a vitamin. I love that. And as I was listening to all of it, I thought, this is what early intervention is about, right? So many of the things that are trauma-informed care are exactly early intervention. And so things like being strengths-based and choice and shared power, and you work with the adults to work with the children. So it was just a perfect connection with early intervention. So I'm going to share with you a little bit about a marvelous little boy I work with. Today we're going to call him Marcus, and his family, and they're just amazing to work with. I've been with them for a year now. He is so fun and energetic. The other day I called him Little Ball of Sunshine. I mean, he's awesome. He is currently living with his foster mother, foster father, and a foster brother. He's a little bit older than him. Marcus is 3, and he has lived with them for year and a half now, when he was 2. So as I said, he's 3 now, so he was placed with them when he was 2. He had at least one previous placement. I think what's interesting, difficult, challenging, put in the adjective you want to, for work with early intervention, is we don't know a lot of the history about some of the children we're working with. And so we're just kind of working with them as we see them. And sometimes families have medical and background history, and sometimes they don't. So that was another reason I thought this might be an interesting case. Is you know what you know, and you don't know other things. So like I've never met the biological family. I do know that bio mom and dad, between the two of them, there's a history of drug use, incarceration, homelessness. I'm guessing, based on what I've heard, domestic violence as well. There's really little or no medical background information for this child, which I think is quite common with my experience working with foster care. This child did lead a very transient life before he came to live with his current foster, and it's a foster adoptive family, so they're very far along in the process of adopting him. So this child did turn 3 in August, so you may or may not be aware that with all of the changes and upheaval with COVID, if families are in early intervention and their child turns 3, but for many of these families, they're still continuing with some of their services. So because he hasn't moved on to a public preschool program, we're still working with him even though he did turn 3. So I know that's a little unusual. He receives occupational therapy and developmental interventionist. Intervention, through the First Steps program. And then the family also has PCIT, which Miriam mentioned in her presentation, and they do that on a regular basis. I believe that's a weekly basis that they do. They do that. I'm not aware of any other private therapies that they're doing. He does attend a full-time, 5-day-a-week childcare program, which he has been in the entire time that he's lived with this family. Of course, when everything was closed in the spring and early summer, he was not attending that program. That was causing a lot of difficulties, as you might imagine. As Mary mentioned, we need consistency and predictability, and there was not that, but he is back to that program. And that's been wonderful for him to be back there, and so he's there back 5 days a week. That program, the staff of the program do have a lot of experience working with children who've experienced trauma in their life. And there's a lot of communication between the school and the family. If you'll, next slide, thanks. Okay, so the case wanted to know a little bit about kind of areas of concern, and so I broke this into sort of from the interventionist point of view, what might be areas of concern, and the family's concern. I think they're all the same. But if you looked at his intervention goals, they're kind of focused on speech and language. Lots of things with sensory seeking, sensory seeking, sensory seeking. He is a child on the move. He is a child who likes lots of touching and smashing and feeling and crashing and swinging and jumping, and this group, you know what that means, sensory seeking. Lots of concern with safety and compliance issues, and that comes up kind of week after week with visits, and that comes up through school as well. And then routines are hard, so bedtime's especially hard, which I know we've talked about in some other cases through SCOPE. We've talked about this, but tantrums are common at night, night terrors, doesn't want somebody to leave the room, wants them to stay with him, getting up in the middle of the night and doing things perhaps he shouldn't be doing. So nighttime is difficult. Oh, if you go back for just a second, let me make sure the family concerns. So again, tantrums, defiance. Again, those change over time, but you can imagine what a 3-year-old might be. The concerns. Safety is a huge one. So keeping Marcus safe, keeping his brother safe, keeping the children in school safe. So safety is a big issue. Just recently kind of thinking through like where's the best placement for this child. So for those of you in the early intervention world, there's a big shift that happens at age 3. And so where's he gonna spend his time? Should he be in private childcare? Should it be public preschool? Should it be a private preschool? Where should this child be, and how's he gonna receive the services that he needs to get? Has been a big discussion lately. And then the family is also very interested in doing evaluations looking at autism and ADHD. So both of those have had some red flags. I'm not sure where those red flags have come from. I'm not sure if that comes through private therapy. I'm not sure if that comes through childcare. I'm not sure if it comes through First Steps, but I know that has been a major concern for this family in the past few weeks. Okay, next slide. Goals. I'd say the biggest is about challenging behavior, just because that's so disruptive to home and school, so when you get, the family will get emails or texts or calls or talk about things that pick up and drop off, and there's been challenging behaviors at school, so that causes a problem. And then just at home, it's just difficult. And then another goal is, as I'm already mentioned, kind of continuation of services. Where do these services come from to serve this child as he's moving out of early intervention and moving on into, as he's kind of growing up. Barriers. The foster family would definitely say that when this child sees his biological family, that he has additional behavior concerns. They call it a regression, like his behavior kind of regresses. Sometimes that's planned, sometimes that's not planned. If somebody shows up at school unannounced. And so that's a really big concern. And then, as I've already alluded to, the changes in routine and services and childcare being closed, that therapy, interventions are now on telehealth instead of in person. That has been really difficult for this child and obviously for the family. Strengths, this family's just, as I mentioned, just fabulous to work with. They're just a model family. They truly are. That's why another reason I want to share them with the case. This child has a very, very strong attachment with foster mom, foster dad, foster brother. Really, really strong attachment. He just loves being with them. The parents are amazing at implementing interventions. They will talk about things that they learned at PCIT, and we'll talk through what that looks like, how it's similar or different than what we're doing in our sessions. They take the ideas that I give them and they just run with it. They come up with their own ideas, their own insights. They'll, we'll meet back and they'll say, hey, I just kind of noticed this, and so I tried this, and it is working or it's not working. And so that's just marvelous to see how they can implement, and they have so many things going on. There's so many different interventionists they work with. I don't know that I could combine all of that and kind of synthesize it, but they seem to do a really wonderful job with that. As I mentioned, there is an older child, just a few years older. I think he's 5. So they're already really savvy about the foster care system, about how to, I don't know, maybe get extra services or extra things paid for because of, being in the foster care system. So that's nice to kind of know how to navigate their way through that. And they're just so eager for any and all interventions for this child or any programs that are available. So that's a wonderful strength. I think that's all I've got.
Well, that's great. Thank you, Elizabeth, for providing that snapshot for us. That sounds like he is receiving lots of good services, and we'll put our, group think, our think tank minds together and see if we can come up with some additional opportunities or solutions for this family. So Brandon will send us into our breakout groups. And we will stay in there until about 3:15, and then we will come back together in just a few minutes. Have great conversations. Button, it just didn't take. I'm so sorry. Okay. All right. Well, that was a quick conversation, but I am really excited to hear from the group and see what kind of solutions have come up in your conversations. So is there someone that would like to kick us off?
I can do it.
Okay, thanks, Wendy.
So just briefly, the strengths we listed, and I feel like we always kind of all end up with the same strengths, but lots of formal supports with the family. They're very knowledgeable in dealing with what they've got going on, very willing to try the new strategies. He's got an older sibling, which hopefully is a good situation. And then the child care center sounds like it's really unusually supportive. So we kind of divided the strategies into some different areas for sleep. We talked about trying to find some ways to help him self-regulate at bedtime. And some of the thoughts we had were like a therapy dog or some kind of a therapy pet.
Ooh.
weighted blankets, some kind of a light or different sensory toys that, and you'd have to experiment to figure out what would work for him, but textured items, a body pillow. It would just be an experimental process to figure out what his sensory needs were for that. I also brought up like a metronome or a heartbeat background noise, some type of a white noise background, and maybe therapeutic listening of some sort with either music or an actual prescribed program of that. For the aggression, that it seemed like he had some aggression, I guess, at daycare and maybe home, offering a calm down corner with some self-regulating toys and things that he could use in that area, probably kind of mirroring some of the stuff he might have in his bed or in his bedroom. And then one of our people brought up maybe a Montessori classroom might be a little bit easier for him to manage, just because of it's more of a sensory experience, and there's more peer models that are a little bit older that would be modeling appropriate behaviors. And then with the bio visit, stress that he seems to have, some coaching for the biological parents, and social stories that could be that the foster parents could do with him before and after the visits to help him understand what's going on. That's all we had, I think.
Those are great solutions. Those are good recommendations. All right. Can we hear from another group?
Okay, so we talked about the strengths for the child, and I think, like I echo, there's a lot of good stuff that we keep saying. So the daycare that works with the kiddos have a good history of working with kids with trauma experience, and there's a low teacher-student ratio. The foster family is supportive. And they want to learn strategies, and they want to incorporate them. They already have resources in their toolbox because they've already adopted one little one, so they have some experience with helping Marcus. Having a strong attachment to the foster family, which also shows, like, within him, that he is able to form an attachment, and that's a real strength as well. And that it looks like that there's no placement disruption that's going to happen with this foster family, because they are looking to adopt. So some of the strategies is make sure that family and child have consistent routines. Look into the night carers and see what might be causing it, like medications, certain foods. When we look at it through the trauma lens, does trauma have anything to do with the night carers? So to look into that piece. Have a consistent schedule with the bio family, because it does seem to cause a little bit of disruption in Marcus's life. And then incorporate the bio family into some kind of therapy or treatment or team meeting to get everybody on the same page. Have the foster family prepare Marcus for the bio parental visits before and after to help him with a smoother transition. And along with the ADHD and autism assessment, to also have a comprehensive trauma assessment as well, just to make sure you're covering all that needs to be covered, and so that the proper services and supports can be put in place as they need to be. And then also having him do those recreational activities that he likes to do to work out some of that energy, to give him some, I don't know, just to let him have fun and to be a 3-year-old. And the resources we talked about, and we pretty much ran out of time on this, but we were talking about the music, like the parent and child activities that some communities might have, and how music played a really big part in one family's journey of, getting better.
Well, those are great. So I'm going to actually turn it over to Miriam now to see which of those recommendations she thought were good, if she needs to add anything to us. And I
Yeah.
would like to pose one question.
Sure.
Marian. So given that we're not totally clear on what the involvement of the bio family will be once this child is adopted, we're kind of curious to see what recommendations you would have in a scenario such as that, and kind of preparations for the child. So I'll turn it over to you, and you can just bring us home.
Tell me what you mean by preparations for the child in terms of changes that may happen, like losing contact with biofamily if there's a TPR, or that if it continues like this for a long time, or both.
Yeah, well, I
possibilities.
guess we don't know
Right.
exactly what the timeline is here, so it's
Right.
kind of a broad question.
Yeah, so I want to back up for a minute and say that, like, I learned so much from hearing what you all say in terms of specifics. As early childhood people, you have so many tools in your toolbox to share with parents. Many of them are consistent with being trauma informed, as we talked about, and just to always remember that as you're doing those and suggesting those things, to really think about those elements and how can this promote psychological safety and relationship building and trust and all of those kinds of things. So I would say that the big flag for me when I saw this case was that I think that there's the potential that a lot of his behaviors are related to traumatic stress. And so I would want to really tease that out certainly before I started some ADHD intervention types of things, and also to be aware of that so that everybody could be holding that possibility at the same time that maybe they're thinking about, is there something happening in a sensory realm that could be indicative of some autism, or is it actually more related to some of the implications of the neonatal substance use exposure, those kinds of things. Like, there's a lot to tease out, and some of it is going to have to wait and see. So my perspective would be, why not go heavy on the trauma-informed approach, right? Because there's no harm. It's going to reinforce all of the things that we know are good and healthy, and we may be able to then see what that helps and what that damps down. And the reason to do that first is because if we go for the autism or the ADHD kinds of interventions first, and we haven't addressed the trauma stuff, then we could be doing everything that we know to do and be doing it perfectly and be doing it beautifully. And this kid may still be symptomatic. And that's going to be frustrating for the child, frustrating for the parents, and inevitably, even the best of parents start to blame the child. And then you have some real impairments and impediments to the relationship, right? And so we want to really strengthen that relationship in as many ways as possible and reduce the threats to that relationship. And so by starting from the place of this could be trauma, we beef that up in the best possible way and then layer on the other pieces that can fill in the gaps, as opposed to the other way around, which can be detrimental. That obviously is the orientation that I come from, right? I had only been in the field for 4 years when I heard John Briere and Lucy Berliner talk about trauma, and I was converted. And so I've been doing trauma for, since 1989. That's been my orientation. My behaviorist friends will say to me sometimes, "Oh, you think everything's trauma?" And I say, well, actually it is, but that's because I'm right. But somebody else might say something different, but that's my rationale for that. So I would say that would be like really big. So in this context of managing the bio parents, I think somebody in our group pointed out that we really want to make sure that those visits are scheduled and routine, even if the parents don't always show up for them, so that there can be the appropriate preparation. And we're preparing Marcus, but we're also preparing his parents, and we're reminding them he's going to need extra help. This is just like if you have to go and get a shot, right? Or if you have to go and have some kind of medical procedure, right? And parents do all kinds of additional caretaking when their kids have that. So the analogy of medical care is always a very useful one, because nobody ever questions the fact that parents have to give more. But sometimes when it's behavioral, we expect kids to manage it in some way that's actually an unrealistic expectation. So you hear the bias in my response. The bias in my response is, it is less about helping Marcus. The way that we help Marcus manage is we help the adults around him, right? And so really, to be trauma informed with a young child is to beef up these foundational support networks around him so that he can manage and not be as activated in those environments and those contexts. So really what we have to do is we have to help the parents either not be anxious before they know something's happening and transmit that, so that they transmit a loving, caring, you're going to see, you know, whatever he calls bio parents today. And we're going to be here when you get back. And this is what we're going to do when you get home, right? And to remind him over and over and over again, things are going to be the same. So that if there is ongoing visits, he gets used to the fact that even if he doesn't like it, we all have to do things we don't like. Like that's life, right? And unfortunately, 3-year-olds learn that too. So that he starts to learn that even things that feel really yucky, I can come back to a safe place. And even if I'm dysregulated, I can get back to where I was. And that's really the message that we want to convey. And as we're conveying that to him, we're also conveying that to the parents, so that they stop worrying that this means somehow that he is permanently damaged or never going to be able to get better or whatever else. He is reacting as if he had to go to the ER and have stitches once a week. Right?
That's an interesting analogy. And thank you for your response to that question, and for just reacting to some of the suggestions that we heard today. I know there were lots more, and that we will share when the compilation of all of your team's suggestions will be shared. So let me see. I am having trouble finding my PowerPoint today.
Well,
basically,
I just wanted to point out one thing.
Oh, go ahead.
There was one thing listed on the list
Yes.
of interventions, that is a UK Center for Trauma and Children initiative called TIPS. So if you're not in the eastern part of the state, you may not be familiar with that. That's something that we developed while I was there. It's in its beta testing, and maybe now in its more pilot testing. Anyway, it's a fabulous caregiver-focused intervention for kids of all ages, and hopefully it will become well-known and be published soon, but I forgot to mention that may be one people don't know. Now I'm done. Sorry.
okay, that's great. Thank you. I'm sorry. I have too many tabs open, evidently, on my computer. Looks like someone's helping me out. It's nice to have a good team. All right. Well, I'll turn it over to Emily. Thank you.
Okay, so I will be sending out the evaluations after we wrap up here and before 5 o'clock today. So if you could keep an eye out for those, just a note that only one evaluation is open at a time. So if you could complete this one before our next session, that would be very helpful. And I can't go back and reopen old evaluations, just I've had some questions about that. So the incentive, Marjorie Velo, am I saying that right, is our lucky winner from last time. So congratulations. And next session will be shared following our final session. Okay, so at the final session, we will share, which is our next session, right, in 3 weeks. We'll share the book selections for attendees who have come to all sessions. If you have any questions, you can email Caroline, Christine. Any technological questions, you can email Brandon. Evaluation questions, you can email me, Emily. And we are still looking for a case for our last session in 3 weeks on November 17th. So if you have a case that you want to discuss and bring to the group, please share with us as soon as possible. We're always very excited to receive those. So our next session, November 17th, 3 weeks from today, is the role of peers for families in recovery. And we look forward very much to seeing you then. Thank you so much for your attendance, and thank you, Miriam. And gosh, I forgot the
Elizabeth and Elizabeth.
Elizabeth, thank you for your case today. We appreciate you so much. And Miriam, thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
Go out and make every moment a trauma-informed moment.
Yes.
Thank you. You all have a good evening.
Thank you.
Miriam, I have another